There are some dark places in the world. It's shit ugly, and it's full of shit ugly people. Places we never see, that lay hidden for decades. Places that were hidden before the world moved on, and we became interconnected and networked. Now, everyone is distracted, and those places are all but forgotten. Old malls where the dust is thick and the maintenance personnel sleep on the floor at night after the few remaining stores shut down. Bleached white general stores beside the interstate that no one stops at except the old rough men from the mill. The blocked off interstate truck stops where drugs were once sold, women prostituted, and eldritch symbols carved into the trees in the clearing. The digital generation doesn't even know these places exist. I know this because I'm of that generation. Those random dirty floors that used to reek of cigarette smoke and old coffee from my childhood. The smells of basements where strange old men sold antiques beside the road. Hidden America is real. I've been there. The only way to get into this is to just tell it the way it happened and skim over the slow parts. What I'm telling you is true. None of it a lie. I may have to paraphrase some conversation since I don't have a memory like a computer, but it's all going to be written down to the best of my memory. I'm 35 years old. My name is Henry. I'm from the mountains of western North Carolina. I served in the Marine Corps in my mid-20s. I'm athletic, but I look pretty unassuming. I'm not particularly handsome or tall, but my powerlifting total's always been pretty high, and I'm not afraid of a good run. These two things, my military service and athleticism, are not on this page because I'm bragging about myself or trying to sound like I'm some kind of badass. I'm telling you this because it does have some bearing on the events that take place. Some decisions that I have made, and some things that I did wouldn't have happened if it weren't for those components in my personal history. When I left the military, I became a private investigator and got my hands on an armed security license. It was a good gig. I worked for a couple of companies as a security consultant and did some investigations on individuals who were stealing from their employers or attempting to defraud them for workers' compensation. Simple things. I wasn't a private dick sipping whiskey like Philip Marlowe, waiting for some gorgeous dame to try to con me into sending her husband to jail. No jilted lovers, no drama. No drama at all, right? Until one day I was providing security for one of our executives during a protest downtown. They were loud outside the car. The police hadn't arrived to quell the mob yet, so they were still in the street. Men and women clad in masks were holding up signs decrying the banksters, yelling, hurling bottles. The car rolled to a stop outside of the regional corporate office where they were congregated. Later I would find out that the executive I was assigned to for the duration of the trip had leaked his location through social media, and they had organized their little demonstration to take place as we were en route to the office. They clustered around the vehicle, banging on the windows, walking on the hood. My principal was a 60-something-year-old man who had worked in the walls of offices with hardly any physical obstacles to overcome since he graduated from college. He was scared. I put my hand on the pistol underneath my blazer and held my hand out to him palm first. "Please, relax, sir," I said calmly. The last thing I wanted was for him to have some kind of heart attack. Outside the vehicle, I could see multiple figures clad in black wearing ski masks as they worked their way through the colorful crowd. "Capitalism is killing us, motherfucker. Can't you see that? Are we fucking loud enough for you now?" A man in a neon green shirt was screaming into the tinted window I sat behind. The men in black circled around the vehicle 3 times before finally closing in on our 2 passenger doors. While everyone else was raising hell, they just stood there, peering into the glass. "Get us the fuck out of here right now," I commanded, as I leaned forward and clutched the driver's shoulder. Are you crazy, Henry? I can't drive through them. There's so many bodies on the car, it wouldn't even budge if I floored it. We'll see. Gun it or we're about to be in trouble. I flipped the safety off on my handgun and held tight to the grip. The driver stomped his foot to the floor and the engine whined weakly as it attempted to get power to the ground and move. The car rolled forward slowly, causing a couple of the protesters on the hood to lose purchase where they were standing and fall off. The dark figures signaled to each other with hand gestures, and the one on my side of the vehicle ran around to the other, stepped behind him, and put his hand on the other's shoulder. The closest man raised a short-barreled shotgun while the other produced a glass bottle full of brown liquid and lit a rag at its top. They had malicious intent, but were not professionals. I was a professional. As the man with the shotgun worked the slide to chamber a round, I was already drawing and firing as simultaneously I slammed the old man's head down between his knees. I couldn't hear shit in the car except a high-pitched whine as I emptied the magazine into the window. Somehow they were both on fire now, screaming. And as the rioters dispersed around the vehicle, the engine came alive with a roar, and we left rubber on the road as we pulled away. I called the police, and we proceeded immediately to the closest station. The executive had shit his pants. The cops debriefed me. I surrendered my firearm, and after the officers returned with their report on the two men I'd laid out in the street, I was free to go, but told not to wander too far. You son of a bitch, this should have never happened. Oh my God, my fucking back. I think you pulled my groin, you son of a bitch. I shit my fucking pants, the executive said, as another private detail pulled up and he climbed into their SUV. You could walk home, motherfucker. I better not ever see your ass again. I didn't. I saw an Eagle Globe and Anchor tattoo on one of the officers and asked him if he knew a decent taxi service around. He responded with a grin and took me back to my apartment in the front of his car. A few weeks later, I had to testify in court. They'd found evidence that the intent of the two men was to hit us with a shotgun a few times and then burn the vehicle from the inside. My story never changed. The other attorneys tried to make the violence of what happened make me look like my force was excessive. Our corporate lawyer explained what happens when bullets strike a thin glass bottle full of gasoline next to a lit rag, which in turn was next to a loaded sawed-off shotgun. It went on like that for a couple of months. Of course, I had been fired on the spot that day, and didn't have enough income to keep the bills paid during the trial. In the end, I wasn't brought up on charges, but I was blackballed. Associated with a high-profile case, I wasn't considered risky as security or an investigator, but my reputation compounded with the executive's insistence that it was all my fault and kept me from getting rehired. 6 months down the road, I'm working night security at a construction site and living out of my truck. There's a peace to that kind of life. You know, my days were kind of like a strange underwater experience, trying to catch some rest under the white glow of the sun coming through my windshield with a reflector up and the diesel engine idling out its loping white noise. It was like sleeping in a submarine beneath a white sea with talk radio. Life went on. No one stole any welders. Every now and then an old pickup would circle the site, and I'd pack another dip and walk around the sleeping structures that were slowly coming to life. During that time, the truck was the only curiosity. It looked like an old Ford, maybe from the 80s or 90s. Every couple of days it would swing around the site and roll down the road. It had a distinct sound. Straight pipes. Big engine. A certain type of echo beneath the extra long bed. I could pick up on that sound anywhere. I did pick up on it anywhere. One morning I'd slept for maybe an hour before the dawn broke, and that thing rolled up beside me in the old lot I was staying in. The door opened and shut quickly. I was awake. I shoved my feet in my sneakers and sat my seat upright. I kept my head low and put my hand on the reflector so I could tear it down and throw the vehicle into drive to make my escape. It got real quiet outside. And then a loud, friendly voice called my whole name out to me as if they were asking a question. I don't mean to alarm you, honest. I know you were sleeping, but I don't have any good way to get a hold of you other than this. In my mirror, I could see a weathered, middle-aged man wearing clothes that any rural farmer would consider his proper outfit for going to town. An ancient rodeo buckle hung beneath his large torso. He had his hands up, and unless he had a gun tucked in his waistband in the back, I couldn't see. He wasn't armed. I pressed my new pistol against the door and rolled my window down and waved him over. What do you want? I asked him. Hey, I know this is a queer way to do this, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. Honest. My name is Junior Barnes. I've seen your truck before. Why have you been following me to work? Son, honestly, it was all part of this. Just me trying to find you. I cut him off. How do you know my name? Did someone from the bank send you? What? God, no, son. He stuttered a little on that last word. I was confused, still. I had just started sleeping hard enough that I felt hungover and sick when he woke me up. If you're here to serve me papers or something, you can go the fuck away. Please, listen. My boy, he knew you. He was a sailor. Went by his mother's name. He told me about you and him drinking beer on the weekends. Said you were from our part of the world, near Asheville. His name's Doyle Kent. He stuttered again and got choked up. I lowered the handgun and put it on the seat beside me. Doyle was a good guy. He'd been a corpsman. We met at a powerlifting meet in Atlanta. We never served together, but we spent a fair few weekends chasing a good time at the bars around town when we weren't working. We both agreed that we still had a fever, so every couple of weeks we'd go on what we called libo, and treated the weekend like we'd been in garrison and were released for weekend liberty. We didn't do anything bad, but every now and then he'd bust some dude's nose or I'd get us thrown out of a strip club. He was a good guy. I just didn't know a terrible lot about his personal life. Part of our no-drama rules during our weekends, when we'd both drive to South Carolina and meet each other halfway so we could go wild. Doyle died a few weeks ago. He was my only boy, and I'd been looking after his wife after he passed. Holy shit. I slid the pistol back into the console of the truck and opened the door. Junior Barnes took his hat off and wrung the bill in his hands. When I'm not working the farm, his brothers handle it, and I drive a truck for extra money. He was getting choked up, looking at the ground. Hey, it's all right, big guy. I'm sorry to hear that. Doyle was a good man, I said. What can I do to help you? Thought he was going to ask for money, honestly. I would have given him what I could and mailed more out to him. House hunting could wait. Crystal, his wife, I was helping take care of her until she started working again, and when I came home this last time, she was gone. House turned upside down. Nothing stolen. She was just gone. I called the sheriff, but he wasn't much help. He just called it in, and they said they'd get back to me. He wiped his eyes and put his hat back on. Look. Doyle always told me, he said, Henry's good at finding things and people, and he's honest. He talked about you all the time. It was something I didn't know. Junior Barnes went on to tell me that Crystal Kent was like a daughter to him, and that after she disappeared, he'd seen my name in the news after the shooting, but couldn't let go of what Doyle had told him. Junior said that the police hadn't been any help at all, and he couldn't find anyone in the Asheville area he trusted so far. Then he started talking about the money, he told me. I had my new truck paid for, but I went ahead and sold it. I'll give you every cent from that if you can help me find her. I thought long and hard about it. Doyle was good, truly. He'd been a medic and was working as a firefighter. He was my friend. How'd Doyle die? I asked. He got hit by a car while he was changing a tire. I told him that I was living in the truck so I could save up for a solid down payment on a little house somewhere. So I had money. But actually investigating a person's disappearance costs money once you start traveling around. I told him that I didn't want to make any profit off of him, but I was probably going to need some money for travel and food. He reached into his wallet and handed me a debit card. I had those girls at the bank point this card at the account I dropped the money into. There's about $50,000 in there for you to do whatever you need to do, he said, as long as I get her back. I asked him if he was sure, if he didn't want to go with me to a bank and set something up. He told me that he'd been on the road for a few weeks and he was going back out. It's a deal, I said. When I went to shake his hand, he pulled me into a hug and said, Doyle always said you were a good man. Doyle was the good one. I'll talk to you as soon as I get started on this. Junior handed me a piece of paper from his shirt pocket with his contact information on it and got in his truck. I hope I hear from you soon, son. I nodded to him and he left. That's how it really started. I'll spare you the details of my downtime and the trip to North Carolina. I quit my job, prepaid my storage unit for a year after unearthing a couple more firearms, some clothes, electronics, and other gear, and 3 of my suits from when I worked for the bank. I didn't have Crystal and Doyle's address, but the internet found that for me. A reverse lookup on his phone number and some sifting through the results revealed that they'd been trying to sell their house. A couple days later, and I was there. It was a modest place, a small ranch home about 20 minutes away from Asheville. A highway ran beside it, but it was set back far enough from the road that you couldn't even see it over the hill. Considering that the house belonged to a man who loosely hired me, I casually walked up to the front door and used a bump key from what I consider my D&E kit to unlock the door. Inside, the house was a mess. I made a couple of passes through it. Front door to living room to bedroom to bathroom to bedroom to dining room to kitchen and back door, then reversed. There was no clear indicator of what had happened. Normally, when a person is abducted, there's a pretty clear trail of destruction from the location where the person was seized to the exit that was used for the abductors to leave with them, so long as they were conscious enough to fight back. This wasn't the case, though. Here, the place had simply been thrown, as if someone had methodically torn through every drawer, closet, and container they could find. The state of the place piqued my curiosity, and on my 3rd pass or so, I started to notice some discrepancies. The living room had been torn apart with the laptops and the coffee table, and a single cell phone had been untouched and were still charging. Doyle's gaming system was intact and still hooked up to a large flat-screen television. The sofa and chairs were upright and uncluttered, despite most of the surfaces and glass tables having been broken and covered in debris. All of the pictures on the walls had been torn down and thrown in a pile in the corner. I made a note to examine them when I came back, just in case someone had left prints on the glass. A large navy jack hung on the wall, completely undisturbed, held up by 2 mismatched thumbtacks. "Don't tread on me," the snake said, laid flat against the wall of red and white stripes. The first bedroom, which appeared to originally be just a guest bedroom that had been rifled through. I couldn't tell if there had been any valuables in the room, but logically it would make sense to me that no one keeps anything valuable that needs to be nailed down in a guest bedroom. The bathroom was filthy as well as thrown. Honestly, that was the most disturbing thing about the whole house that I'd seen at that point. Was that room. The mirror had been smashed to pieces, which mostly laid in the sink, and the toilet looked like it had been repeatedly used without flushing. The smell made me want to vomit. There's no way in hell, in my mind, that any normal woman like Crystal Kent would have used her guest bathroom that way just because her husband died. In the master bedroom, the bathroom was the same story. Crystal and Doyle's modest jewelry was scattered in the random objects thrown around the room, and the bed was still neatly made. The dining room and kitchen were the same. China was broken, silverware and actual silver utensils were mixed together in the chaos. The fridge was still full of food that had been pushed around and knocked over. Definitely wasn't theft. And the police had definitely not been motivated to do any real work in the room. What kind of cop, a thief, would leave a cell phone and 2 laptops charging on the table? It did kind of make sense that the mess would cover up a struggle, or even murder. But I couldn't honestly find any real signs of a fight, or even a broken window or door. No signs that anyone had forced their way in violently. She either let them in, or they picked the lock. The final thing I noticed at the time was that there were no actual weapons in the house. I had never known Doyle to carry a firearm or talk about them, but he was also a former Greenside corpsman who had worked with the Marines. I took my backpack off and hung it on a hook, still attached to the wall, next to the Navy Jack. As I passed by, the cloth fluttered slightly. It was still up with all of the other pictures torn down. Those 2 mismatched pushpins were begging me to ask a question. So I did. I grabbed it by the bottom left corner and pulled just hard enough for the pin above it to tear loose from the wall. And what lay behind it startled me. Flat, greasy red lines looked as if they'd been painted on the wall by someone's fingertips. They spiraled and connected with one another. Where the image contained in a photograph on the top left was a series of connecting archaic lines that formed what I'd probably call a sigil. From what I know about that kind of thing, it looked like 3 5-pointed stars drawn over one another, with small bursting patterns twined all around it. Below that, in what would be the center, was a crude line drawing of a human head that appeared to be leaking copious amounts of red matter from the side, as if it was being drained. And below that, the thing that really made me cringe were words underlined by a red and brown streak the width of a fist. Tread on you. I studied it, took pictures, and decided it was time to collect the evidence and pack up. Nothing in this house would be more telling than that mural. I nicked the edge of the streak with a swab and sealed it up. The pile of picture frames were all busted, and the faces had been torn out and scratched. Every salvable piece of glass got a good dusting, and the results were all collected. I studied the micro-terrain of the mural and noticed it smelled a lot like the bathroom. At the top of the wall, where the pin had been pulled free, I noticed that it had 2 separate holes where the pin had been reinserted. This was most likely the reason why it had come loose first when I tugged at it. The other pin had only been pushed in once. I then took the following from the house before I made a final pass through with a high-definition video camera and exited. The Navy Jack, 1 cell phone, 2 laptops, accompanying chargers for the electronics, a small bag of the mirror shards, and a set of keys that I found in a pile of trash in the kitchen. Outside, despite my nerves being rattled by the mural, I looked through their cars and couldn't find anything interesting. I did my best to leave as much evidence in the place as I could, because I knew that as soon as I knew for certain that this was exactly what I thought it would be, I'd be making some phone calls, and the FBI would be all over that structure, tearing it apart. I kept the keys instead of returning them so I could make molds of them and get them replicated for any future need that might arise. When I was done with that, I was going to return them and the electronics to the trash pile. The real world outside was like coming up for air after swimming in a murky lake. The breeze was cool and fresh. I got in my truck and stared at the house for a moment, then turned the engine over and left. That night I reviewed the materials I collected and started going through the electronics. The phone had one of those lock screens with a pattern, but I figured it out pretty easy by looking at the fingerprint trails on the glass. I recorded it. Both laptop computers were locked with a password though, so I had to remove the drives and dig through them manually on my own computer. They didn't reveal much at first glance, so I locked them up in a very secure, watertight toolbox in the bed of my truck for later use. Intuition and experience taught me that information like that is still useful, even if you don't see anything you need at first. I'd rather drive around with extra shit in the back of my truck than need some reference for a lead and not have it. Came to a pretty quick conclusion that there was too much left behind in the house for any real police officer. If it spooked me, it would spook them. You see, one thing holds pretty true in investigation work as well as regular police work, and that's that most of the time, things actually are the way they look. If a guy looks like he's cheating on his wife, he probably is. If a woman is jogging around her neighborhood, she probably doesn't have the back injury she was litigating her employer over. If some younger, unathletic white male is being overly hostile at work and recently bought a gun, he's probably got plans to shoot up the place. If a cop walks into a house that's been turned on its side and has crazy shit written on the walls, he and his chain of command don't follow up on it at all, then they were probably involved somehow, or in a position where they will lose something if it's discovered. I saved the number for the closest FBI regional office in my phone for quick access and compiled a list of names that I could find for the local sheriff's department. News articles and social networking made it fairly easy to locate these individuals. At the end of the night, I packed a dip, watched a little TV, did my nightly hygiene, and hit the rack. The next day, I loaded my gear up and cruised through town. I found a couple of their cars here and there on the road, and landed in a coffee shop that overlooked the police station. I didn't have enough time to memorize anyone's faces or names outright, so I just had to play the waiting game. An older woman offered to just keep filling your cup up, sugar, after I gave her an early tip in the form of a $20 bill for the use of her table. She was nice, but looked kind of worn out. Her skin had years of tanning in it, and her hair was bleached blonde. Mind you, I've only worn sunscreen a handful of times in my life, so one day I'll get there too. No real judgment here, just observation. She looked like she liked to party when she could. People like that are useful, so I made a note of her name and the address we were at so I could find her later. The police came and went from the station outside. A van marked Appalachian Nature Tours rolled through and let some tourists out. All of it was mundane, which was what I wanted. Establishing a baseline in the local human topography of a place is important when you're hunting for anomalies. I, of course, blended in perfectly with this baseline. In the city, I wore suits and nice clothes. In the suburbs, I looked like a typical dad for some ungrateful turd tween who is always at soccer practice. And out here, I just looked like a regular Joe or Bubba who worked for the state driving a dump truck. Save for the fade. I've always kept a good fade to make up for the fact that my face is plain enough to blend in with a crowd of 5 people. I must have drank half a gallon of coffee by the time my moment arrived. The shift changed. A quarter till the hour, a handful of civilian vehicles started pulling into the back lot of the police station. As they did, I dropped another 20 on the table and walked out front to my truck. New vehicles started coming out. A truck and 2 cars. I had to pick one, so I casually got in my vehicle and pulled out as the last car passed through the intersection. I followed it, all the way home. The officer lived just outside of the city limits. It was a nice little house, but modest. There were no other vehicles in his driveway, which for a cop working 12-hour shifts meant to me that if he did live with someone, they weren't home. I could have just jumped out of the car then, but instead I was patient. I marked the location and noted it at a stop sign and made my way back to town. Knowing where a person lives is useful, even if you don't know too much about them. I did this so I could cross-reference his address and get his actual name and see if it was on my list. I'd already made up my mind that anyone involved in the department may be a part of the stagnation of their investigation. This officer was the first one. The person I really wanted was the sheriff himself, a man whom I had been able to profile from his department's website. I made quick work of his digital fingerprints to find out where he lived. I didn't break any laws, especially considering that he was such a public figure. Over the course of the next few days, I repeated this process, just enough not to raise suspicion. I collected the names, locations, and relations of 5 of the other officers and changed motels. With the intelligence compiled, I made my move. The sheriff lived in a McMansion, the closest thing that this tiny town had to a suburb. He had some tight-bodied hunting dogs in the back, and a truck that probably cost twice as much as mine. When I rolled up, he was walking a bag of food out to the kennels on his stout shoulder. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I could, but it pissed me off. My friend was dead, and his wife was missing. In this tiny town. A town under this man's jurisdiction, and if he was aware of what had happened but was spending his time playing with his damn dogs, I was going to lose my mind. I didn't though. I got out of the truck as he waved to me and hefted the feed onto the top of a couple of barrels near the kennel. He walked back across the yard and around the side of the house. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" he asked me. He was friendly but loud. I could read a hint of frustration in his voice. The dogs barked and whined in their kennels behind him while we talked. "I was just here to get some information from you, Sheriff," I said. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, let the silence eat at him. He didn't say anything, but his eyes glazed over like he was waiting for me to continue. "Well?" He was impatient. That was fine. It really was. I just needed to read him, and the FBI would do the rest after I dropped the evidence off at the house and got the truck repainted when I was far enough away. Crystal Kent's disappearance. I was just trying to understand what your department is doing to find her, I said. I left no hints, nothing you could judge, just a simple request. If I'd been doing some kind of deep cover work, I'd have befriended him, at the bar, and get to know him before I could start fishing for information, or I'd use a cover story to mask my request. But I didn't have time for that shit. She'd already been gone for too long. He looked me up and down and crossed his arms defensively. "My boys are doing everything they can to find her. We've gone through our channels and let everyone know that she's missing. The minute we hear something, her family will be informed. Do you have any theories as to the nature of her disappearance?" He leaned in close and growled his next few words. "I don't have anything for you, son. You came to my house." All of his body language was practically screaming, "Fuck off," at me. He gestured back toward the kennels and told me he had to feed his dogs. They were starting to get loud as he walked back toward them. The baying of the hounds echoed across the hollow. I knew what I had to do. I made sure that the mud I had caked on my license plate was still holding. Got back in my truck, then drove back into town. I found a payphone not far from my motel and called the regional office for the feds. I fought with their electronic menu until I found a live operator. I laid it all out for her, using my heaviest Appalachian accent. Several times she told me to slow down, but I told her everything I knew. The house, the mural, the lack of cooperation from the police, everything that I had observed or noticed that I could quickly explain. I gave her the Kent House address and hung up the phone. I swung myself up into my truck and rolled coal out of the parking lot. It took me only a few minutes to drive there at dangerous speeds for a lifted diesel ton truck. I needed to get there and drop the evidence off before anyone showed up. As I came around the corner, there was a bright light casting shadows through the trees, and several vehicles flew past me on the road leading up to the house that Doyle and Crystal had lived in. As I pulled into the driveway, I cut my high beams on and saw multiple figures pouring some kind of fuel onto the house and lighting it with propane torches. The house was engulfed in flames. I pointed my truck at them and floored it, hoping to cut them off in the yard. They panicked and hurled themselves into their vehicles and started heading right for me. I cut my wheel hard to the left, and my truck slid sideways as I tried to head them off, but they got by me. One final straggler had been left behind, and he was sprinting, trying to catch up to the SUV that had just swung around my tailgate as it slowed down for him. I revved my engine and encircled him with my truck, throwing grass and mud everywhere in the dark as he panicked. Confused, he turned around as I rolled to a stop between him and the SUV, and he pointed his flashlight at the tree line at the edge of the yard and took off at a full sprint again. Before I could get traction back in my truck and point in the right direction, he was almost at the edge of the woods. As he took off into the tree line, I slid to a stop and jumped out of my vehicle. Over my shoulder, I could see the others leaving the property in their vehicles, so I pulled my keys out and locked the doors. His flashlight beam was bouncing around in the dark ahead of me. I didn't bother to try to find my own light, and just followed his. I dodged in between trees and ran him down in the dark. He paused for just a slight second as I tucked my shoulder in and slammed into him as hard as I could. The light flew out of his hands and into the dark. I was on top of him. I found one of his arms and twisted it around behind his back as I put all my weight on his spine with my knee. I was furious. His breathing was shallow and fast. Who the fuck are you? Who told you to fucking do this? If he was important, they wouldn't have left him. I knew that I was hurting him with my knee, and I didn't care. The men in the woods. What did you say? I snarled at him and pushed his head down into the damp leaves and upturned ground. Fuck, the whispers are so loud I can't hear anything. It's the men in the woods. It's the men in the woods. I asked him who the men in the woods were, and he just kept complaining about loud whispers. It sounded like bullshit to me. I hoisted him up and kept his arm tight in my fist. With my hand tucked into his waistband, I'd be able to lay him down on the ground again if he tried to escape. We walked to the truck. I had to do some careful maneuvering around his body to get my zip cuffs on him at the truck, but I made it happen. Once he was loaded inside and secured to the passenger side door, we left the property. In my rearview mirror, I could see the house still burning in the dark. The image stuck with me for a long time. Now, my mind was racing at that point. This situation had gone south fast. I'm not explaining this because I'm assuming you're stupid or anything, but I just wanted you to see it from my point of view. The house and all of the evidence inside of it was gone, just as fast as I had found it. Whoever wanted it covered up obviously had their hooks in the sheriff, who thankfully still had no idea who I actually was. I came to that conclusion quickly because he was the only person I spoke to. It made sense then, and still makes sense to me now that they wanted the house to stay in that state for a reason, since they had no problem burning it down at the first sign of danger. They wanted the evidence destroyed, and there were enough of them to fill 3 cars. They could take the time to clean it up. I had one of the arsonists tied up in my truck with me, and he was babbling about men who live in the woods. I still had the electronic evidence, and I had the names and addresses of multiple officers in the department. The FBI was on its way. I was barreling down the road again at this point, tossing both me and the arsonist from side to side. I couldn't interrogate him on the road, and he seemed to be too valuable a suspect to just cut loose, even though he was obviously crazy. Make the fucking noise stop. I can't even think right now. I can't fucking... Please help me, he said, writhing in his seat, trying to press his ears against the inside of the truck. I thought it was some kind of act. It was pissing me off. I told him to cut it out, and then I told him that if he didn't shut the fuck up, I was going to knock his teeth out, so he couldn't talk. I wasn't actually going to do that. Fear is a powerful tool when manipulating a person's behavior. So at that point, the smartest thing I could do was shake him down for ID and markings, then dump him somewhere and tip off the feds, and leave town immediately. But I'm not smart. I'm clever. Smart people make smart decisions that they have calculated the outcome of carefully. Clever people use tricks to flip a situation around over and over again until they get what they want. Fuck, I can't fucking hear anything. They're so loud. It's almost like they're screaming now, man. Fuck, please help me. I don't care if you're a cop or whatever. I feel like I'm going insane, the arsonist pleaded as he rocked back and forth in his seat. So carefully and quietly retreating and observing the investigation from afar is smart, right? That would make the exploitation of the weakest out of a group of arsonists for information about them immediately clever. He was asking me for help, honestly. He had been the weakest and the slowest of their group, and I'd easily ran him down and subdued him. And he was either a spectacular actor or was having some kind of mental breakdown. All I knew was that he had the information about these men in the woods and was extremely vulnerable. Good for me, bad for him. I knew that I had to act quickly, as speed and accuracy are signs of premeditation. I quickly pulled off onto a dirt road that led up to a small vacated church and its cemetery. I stopped the truck and threw my door open. Wait, where are you going? He asked as I walked around the bed of the truck. I pulled a tow chain out of my toolbox and latched it up to the truck, then pulled his door open, cut his wrists loose from the handle, and pulled him out by the collar. He was taller than me, but weaker. I did a quick and easy sweep of his right foot and threw him on the ground next to the chain, then wrapped it around his feet and tied it off securely. All right, look, I told him. You're going to tell me everything you know about everyone involved that burned that house down. You're going to tell me who told you to do it and why. I told him that I'd take him to the hospital eventually if he gave me the information I wanted, and it was accurate. I told him that if he didn't comply, I'd drag him to death behind the truck because I just didn't care anymore. Of course, I would have never done that at the time, but he didn't need to know that. The fear of torture is far more reliable than torture itself. I had to rev the engine a couple of times to wake him up and get him talking, but he did. I told you before, I'm not a computer. I don't have eidetic memory or anything cool like that. I take a shit ton of notes when I'm working and try to record information as I can, since paper doesn't forget. He conveyed to me the following information. His name was Adam. He worked as an HVAC technician in town. One of his friends was involved with the men in the woods first. He didn't know how. They were the ones who abducted her. The men in the woods put the whispers in his head. The men in the woods were human beings, but something was wrong with them inside. The men in the woods ordered that Adam, his friend, and some others burn the house down. They did not explain why. You don't ask the men in the woods questions. I buried my pistol in his stomach because I needed more information so I could find them before the FBI does. I was still a ghost. He had no idea who I was. These men in the woods wouldn't know either. And I threatened to put a hole in his gut and repeated my threat about dragging him. He said there were around a dozen of them. He said that they did some kind of paramilitary training, performed rituals and ceremonies, and gave followers like him and his friends tasks in town. He said that their camp was located off an old logging road from the early 2000s. He told me how to find it. He said they called themselves the Order, but seemed to be lying and changed their story constantly, like they were mocking you if you pressed them and asked too many questions. He said that the last time he saw them was at night, and that they commanded him that the house be burned. He said that they had trucks, SUVs, ATVs, and a ton of small arms. I asked him one final question. Do any of the men in the woods work with the police department? He told me no, but everyone in the department's afraid of them. The sheriff knows where they are, but they're never all there at once. If he attacked them, it wouldn't be very long before they attacked his family, or had us do it for them. Took him down for his wallet and keys, and any identifying marks. He had a terrible-looking tribal tattoo on his arm and a couple of girls' names on him. Once I had him secured in the vehicle again, I hunted down houses that were for sale on my phone. There was one for sale a few miles from the hollow where the logging road lay. It wasn't an ideal hike, but I could make it. I took him there. The lawn was unkept, and it was pretty obvious that the owners weren't currently living there, so I secured him inside with the chain and hid my truck behind the house. The sheriff's department and any of the followers that burned down the house would be looking for my vehicle, so I hoped that having it stashed and concealed would keep them off my trail for at least a little while. I had him chained to the support beam in the middle of the living room. It felt weird. If he were interrogated by the feds, he'd probably end up saying that he had been abducted by me and held captive in a house if he cracked for them as easily as he cracked for me. FBI agents don't generally threaten to drag people to death, though, and he was still complaining that the voices in his head were screaming at him so loud he couldn't think. If any of this got traced back to me, they'd have the testimony of a paranoid schizophrenic describing a white male in his 30s who drives a jacked-up pickup truck, which is basically everyone in town. All I had to do was move quickly and evade law enforcement long enough to ditch whatever profile could be built for me. I gave him some food and water because I'm not a monster, and went over maps of the area on my laptop. A 6-mile night patrol through the woods in the mountains would take most of the night. I would be in position to observe their camp before dawn. I'd be pretty tired, but the walk back would be in daylight, so I'd get out fast. I honestly had no idea what I'd find up there. I just wanted to collect some kind of intelligence that I could leave behind for the feds, since the house was gone. By the time they rattled enough cages in town to find the camp, it'd be vacated. They truly had built up a conspiratorial relationship with the police. I filled up on water, no food, packed a small pack with supplies and some surveillance equipment, and loaded up a belt rig I kept with magazines for the pistol and short-barreled rifle I was taking with me. I didn't want all the extra weight, but Adam said that the men in the woods had small arms and did paramilitary training. I was wearing concealed body armor under my shirt and jacket like I always did. So, if we had to start shooting, I'd have a better chance of getting out with my life. I put the waypoints for the route in my GPS, watered Adam again like a foul-smelling plant. He'd pissed all over himself when I was interrogating him. If you sent me into an ambush, you'll be waiting in this house until the cops find you. And who knows how long that will be. He swore to me that the location I had for them was good, so I headed out. From the road, I couldn't see the truck at all, and after a couple of laps around the house, I concluded that it was fine, and took to the woods. It was a hard walk, and it took most of the night. I managed to hit a couple of deer paths without getting too far off track. The usage of the GPS allowed me to take the path of least resistance without getting lost. Old-fashioned conventional land navigation shoots you through all kinds of underbrush that you had to offset and reorient yourself through with your map and compass. With the GPS, I could weave around a little and keep going. When I finally got the sweat out of my eyes and began to approach, I could see the lights from the camp. They'd nestled themselves against the low spots on a road near a small landing that had most likely been used to cut logs before they'd been drugged down and loaded onto trucks. A few summers working with my family in the woods had given me a little knowledge on the subject. My pack was dark enough in color to lay down in front of me as concealment, so I hid behind it and got my surveillance gear out. There were a couple of small campers, some dome tents, and some fires with men gathered around them. I was trying to snap some pictures when I heard a whisper low in my left ear. "Who are you?" My heart almost jumped out of my chest. I drew my pistol and rolled over, looking all around me in the dark. No one was there. Another whisper in my other ear now. "What do you want?" I kept completely silent and flailed my free hand around in the dark, trying to find whoever was talking to me. "I don't know you. Go away." The voice sounded like a person who had their pitch lowered an octave. It sounded unnatural. Adam had told me that the voices were screaming in his ears. Even though my heart was racing, I didn't say anything and refused to even think a response back to the voice. The whispers continued, but the less I physically acknowledged them by looking around, the quieter they got. "Watching you," the last one said before it tapered off. Part of me refused to believe that it was happening, that something paranormal was trying to communicate with me. But largely, I just accepted it. My experience that night so far had been so strange that I just rolled with it. I'm a skeptical guy, but the rule I was talking about before is true. Most of the time, things actually are what they seem. It only strengthened my resolve to try to prove it wasn't as weird as I thought. The men in the woods down below still hadn't noticed me. They had fires, but no personal illumination as they milled about. The ones closest to me were talking, but I couldn't make out any of their words over the sound of the wind in the trees and the shrieking whispers that were asking me strangely worded questions. The door of the larger camper opened, and a man walked out. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and I could see that he was lean and hard, like a soldier. He had tattoos on him that I managed to get some shots of. In the light that spilled out from inside the camper, I also got a look at his face, and shot that as well. As he approached the fire, the others stood up and made some gesture with their hands that I couldn't make out. He made the gesture back, like he was returning a salute. As this happened, a group clad in black walked silently back into camp from Logging Road that led out to the Hardball Road that joined the highway. They were met by a rover who walked them back into camp as another group walked out. They had security patrols coming in and out. I didn't know if this was normal for them, but I didn't want to take any extra chances. The men who came in had rifles. They walked up to some barrels near the camper and seemed to be refilling water containers. They met the shirtless one by the fire and did their weird salute again. I got pictures of as many of them as I could. The shirtless one was important, and he was addressing the men around the fire. Whatever he was saying, I wanted to hear it, so I aimed my directional microphone at them and did my best to find the perfect spot in the area to hear them. Most of the sound was just ambient noise, particularly the crackling of the fire, but eventually I got to the spot where I could hear his voice. It took too much of my situational awareness away to focus on the voices and just try to listen to them closely, especially with the whispering in my ears picking up again. So I just hooked the microphone up to my recorder and let it run. Also, you should note that in the next few moments, I wasn't holding the audio device in my hands. I had it mounted on a tripod, since it was really sensitive about where I pointed it. I was hands-free and no longer listening to it. I just want that to be understood so it's not confusing when I describe to you what happened next. I had the camera up, just spamming shots, trying to take as many pictures as possible. I set the camera's aperture and ISO to make it extremely sensitive to light, and took pictures of all of their faces. As I did this, I noticed movement again, and someone walked out of the trailer that the shirtless one was in. I swung the camera around, started shooting them as well. It looked like a person clad in a dark robe. They walked over to the fire. As they did, everyone in the circle, save the shirtless one, took a knee, bowed their heads. The shirtless one stood still and faced the person in the robe. My nerves got tense as the whispers grew more frequent. They were asking probing questions about me that I could barely hear, and sometimes said extremely vulgar things. Whatever was happening needed to be documented, so I just held my finger down and the shutter started working automatically, spamming shots into the memory of the camera. The robed figure pulled the hood on the robe back, then unhooked the clasp on the collar and dropped it from their body. It was a woman. Her hair was clumped into dreadlocks, and her arms and legs were impossibly thin and fragile looking. Her mouth was hanging open, and her neck was extremely swollen, covered in scabs and sores that were visibly runny. Her abdomen was so swollen that she looked pregnant in a mound that terminated with long, unkempt pubic hair. At the tips of her fingers and toes were nails so long and ragged I could see them from so far away. Her skeletal face turned to the shirtless one, and her mouth fell open. She extended one of those skeletally thin arms toward him, and he took a knee and kissed the top of her hand. The whispers in my head were constant now, and I started to understand why Adam had been so fucked up. It was enough to make a man go mad. It sounded like a chorus, like a dozen different people were saying the same word, over and over, rhythmically, slowly overlapping one another as they came into and out of sync. I couldn't make it out at first because I was still trying to ignore them. They were saying the word stranger. The bloated woman thing extended one long finger and pointed to everyone in the circle around the fire, one by one. As she did this, the voices all joined each other at once, chanting the word all together now, growing in volume. Stranger, 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 stranger. The woman reached the end of the men in the circle, and her fingers continued around until she was facing me. That index finger traveled up the side of the hill, and she locked eyes with me through my camera. Stranger, stranger, stranger. The voices were not screaming themselves, but sounded like that low-octave whisper increased in volume, like they were right in my ear, like they were whispering into my ear canal. She pointed her finger right at me, and we locked eyes. Her voice came out like the sound of a cat yowling when it's angry, a violent rasp that sounded inhuman and beyond our vocal range. Stranger! She screamed with unnatural volume. I immediately started shoving all of my equipment into that bag that was in front of me and swung my rifle back onto the front of my body before fastening it to me. My microphone was still recording, and I hadn't even turned my camera off. I rolled down the hill in the wet leaves and took off down the hollow. Flashlight beams cut through the dark and cast shadows in the trees. I could hear dogs barking as they were being set loose. I was running for my life. On the steep terrain, I kept tripping and eating shit over and over. I felt blood running from my forehead. All I could see were trees and shadows and the lights behind me. The dogs were coming, and the barks were getting closer. I'd sprint and trip again. My nose hurt. I snorted and could feel liquid coming out of it freely. I kept going. They were shooting at me now, and the dogs were right on top of me. I ate shit again and started shooting wildly at the flashlight beams of my pistol as I got to my feet. A dog circled around me and came at me in a straight line. I got my rifle up and shot it. Its wails sounded wet and ragged as it screamed behind me as I ran. I wasn't using GPS. There was no time. I scrambled like that for what felt like an hour, only barely outpacing the men with the lights that were following me. My abandon was the only thing that gave me speed, sacrificing my body for the sake of escape. Those lights, though. I never saw them trip or stop, and they were always on my heels. The gunshots made hard whizzing and snapping sounds as they hit the trees. One bullet hit me in the back and sent me tumbling over a fallen tree. Another dog came. I shot it. The flashlight came close, and the man behind it walked up to me as he shined it in my face while I lay on the ground. I could see him clearly when I blocked the light. He didn't even look tired, just angry. As he got close, I pulled out a knife and wrapped the blade around behind his foot and pulled toward me as hard as I could. He screamed in pain and shot into the air as he fell. I didn't try to finish him off. No time. More were coming behind him. I shot randomly backwards and holstered my pistol again so I didn't shoot myself, and raised my rifle, charging through the darkness. My legs were getting tired. My entire body hurt. I found a creek and low-crawled in it for a ways, nearly drowning myself in the process, before charging up the bank on the other side. I could hear the dogs still, and the wild shooting of the men. It took a second to reorient myself with the GPS, which I thankfully hadn't crushed. I eased down out of the hills into a cow pasture and shuffled my way back to the house. I immediately went to the truck and started it, then took all my gear off and packed it into the toolbox. In the mirror and the lights I could see my face, and it looked like I'd been hit in the face with barbed wire. Inside the house, I ripped the chains off of Adam and removed any trace that I'd been in there. I threw the chains to the bed of the truck and held him down while I cut him free. I told him I didn't give a shit about what happened to him and that I lied both about killing him or taking him to the hospital. I grabbed him by the shoulders and hip threw him into one of the flower beds so he wouldn't follow me while I ran back to my truck. I threw the zip ties in my seat and left the house. I didn't ease up on the accelerator until I had been driving away from the city limits for half an hour. I still don't know how I wasn't stopped for speeding. I got tired on that drive, but I didn't come anywhere close to stopping until I was almost out of fuel. I washed myself up in the rest area by the interstate and found a hotel in some nowhere town in Virginia. I parked my truck out by the dumpsters, paid cash with a fake name, and moved my more sensitive gear into my room where I could protect it. I still felt shaky. My adrenaline was pumping, and I couldn't rest. I took care of it by drinking my entire hip flask at once and taking a shower, collapsed into a deep, heavy sleep. 12 hours and some change later, I woke up. No cops had come for me. No one had called me. Nothing. I went through my pack and my gear and made an inventory of what I still had after running through the woods. I hadn't lost anything, but some of my equipment was destroyed. One shotgun microphone, one telescopic lens that cost a fortune, and one ceramic plate for my body armor. The bullet had entered my pack, hit the microphone and lens somehow, and buried itself in the plate. It was deformed beyond recognition, and the plate was fractured. The microphone and the lens were the worst loss, but my digital recorder and the body of my camera were still intact. I was still kind of shook up from the night before, but I knew that it was time to get to work on the intelligence that I'd collected. I'd managed to take some good photos. I sorted through them and saved the best ones on my laptop, including multiple pictures of the bloated woman thing. I named her Dolores, because I knew an old trailer queen when I was a boy who went by that name. I despised her as a kid. The pictures of Dolores disturbed me because they were tangible evidence of something that was happening that I didn't understand and wouldn't have thought was real otherwise. Bad guys in the woods, I get that, right? There's always bad guys in the woods somewhere. I'd seen it before. The military specifically trains you to fight bad guys in the woods. But disembodied voices, filthy, bloated hags that can spot you in the dark from over 100 yards away. And shit wasn't supposed to be real. So I wrote down what happened, developed a folder that had all of my pictures and what I saw and heard, and started working on the audio. The audio itself was like a treasure chest of information. The whispering that I'd been hearing had actually masked how clear the audio actually was. And once I turned the volume up, it just sounded like a recording of people talking in another room. The shirtless one was addressing the others. We sent 5. The farm had ordered 7, so we're close, but we only sent 5. She said that we have to meet the quota or we're going to be in deep shit with their bosses up north. We can't be so rough with the females when we grab them, or we're going to keep missing our targets and quotas. I paid Fern and Gamble for their services, so we're down on cash, but if we raid a couple of the meth dealers we've located in town for cash, we can get our reserves topped back off. The door to the trailer opens, and Dolores comes out. They all started muttering some salutation in words that I couldn't make out or spell. There was no actual audio that I could pick up after that. The track is nothing but background noise until the word stranger is screamed at a volume that the recording equipment had to automatically adjust to compensate for. And the sounds of me running, highlighted by gunshots, and the round hitting the mic when I got shot in the back. I did some research on my laptop and found the proper spelling of the name, Schvern and Gamble, and learned that it was a trucking company that operated on the East Coast. The way that he had phrased it, that he had said he paid Schvern and Gamble, stuck with me. It was a trucking company, and he was using them to move women that they had presumably abducted. He would be paying whoever was helping him. Individual drivers would lead him to say, "I paid the drivers," or "I paid Bubba." But he said, "I paid Schvern and Gamble." It made sense in that case that he was paying either the company itself or maybe even the individuals who owned it. I was ahead of the curve, and that town was too weird to go back to. I had been made, and the locals would be looking for me if I went back, even if the FBI was on their way, or even already in town. It was too much heat. So I made the decision to follow the lead. I'd recuperate in town, get the truck repainted just to be careful, and gather more intelligence about the company. When I was good, I'd pay them a visit. I'd scope them out first to see if the FBI had made it that far yet, and if it was clear, I'd get all of the information I could find. And that's exactly what I did. I keyed the shit out of the truck, washed it, and took it to a local body shop. They got curious about my appearance, and I said that my wife caught me with a girl I'd met while traveling through on business, and her and the girl's husband fucked my world up. I told them to repaint the truck black, paid in cash. For the next couple of days, I spent my time researching the trucking company and anyone that was publicly associated with it. I found some drivers, but very little about the owners. The baseball-sized bruise on my back started to turn dark, and the cuts and scratches on my face started healing. My eye was still black, though, but that was going to take time. So much for blending in for the time being. I didn't want to spend extra time waiting around while Crystal Kent was being abducted and sent God knows where, but I also didn't want to get caught up in an investigation and probably go to jail. This was my task, and I had to ensure that it was carried out to the best of my ability. And that's what I did. I spent some time during that period looking through Crystal's phone. It was tedious. I hated it. She'd been texting a female friend of hers for a few days, back and forth, had open communication with most of her friends regarding Doyle's death. And I hated it because it was sad. The text between her and her friend revealed something I had not seen or been aware of before. I wasn't looking for it because I'd been preoccupied with simply looking for any calls or texts she'd made the night of her abduction. Specifically, whether or not she was planning on meeting up with anyone, or had recently announced that she'd be alone, or had even tried to call anyone for help. So I went back and found that her friend Kim, insert random fruit emojis next to her name, had been texting her one night when she had become very alarmed. Someone's outside. She sent a picture of her back porch, which was mostly just darkness and the dim illumination of the porch light. I scrolled back a day. Stupid raccoons. A picture of a broken flower pot with scratches on the floorboards of the porch. Back another day. Dog disappeared last night. Please tell me if you see her. Picture of an overturned water dish on the porch. The picture of the darkness and the words "someone's outside" piqued my interest. I opened it up and ran it through some of the image processing filters I ran my own night photography through before. Dimly, just barely, I could see the profile of a figure standing in the dark. A thin arm and leg jutting out from behind a tree. A single wide eye and an open gaping mouth. They'd been observing her and probably took her dog. I saved the picture and put it with the rest. I made up my mind that whatever that thing was, I was going to learn its secrets. It was my nature to dig. And that thing, Dolores, had all of the dirt in the world hidden there. And that neck so bloated it looked like it was going to burst. And that gut that looked tight as a drum head, like it was stuffed with something. When the truck was finished, I packed up my kit and left. Schwern and Gamble's main office was in a town called Neon, Kentucky. The drive was a pain, but whatever. There's hardly anything interesting to look at when you're driving through that state. I got lucky when I located them. They were tucked away in a small town next to a gas station and some old bars, with a vacant building across the street from it. Multi-story. Brick. Some windows bashed out here and there. I parked my truck about 3 miles away in the parking lot of a motel that I was not going to be staying in. Getting vehicles repainted is expensive, time-consuming, and suspicious. I wouldn't want to be doing that again unless I absolutely had to. The reason I say I got so lucky was that the creek down below the road allowed me to travel back and forth from the building at night without being observed. I broke into the building and set up shop on the second floor. My best lens was gone, so I used my backup and took more pictures. Always more pictures. You honestly can't ever have too many when you're surveilling someone or doing reconnaissance, so long as they're of high quality. People, vehicles, equipment, everything enhances your ability to make decisions and act. Everything is there for a reason. Nothing is actually out of place, even if it looks like it is. It was a single-story building with semis and only a couple of trailers coming in and out of their parking area slowly as the day went by. During the day, the garage bay doors were open and mechanics toiled doing repairs and maintenance. There honestly wasn't anything unusual about the place from the outside. When they closed down for the day, I waited until dark and broke in using a lockpick set on a flimsy side entrance door. There were no alarms, which was just a gamble I was making. If there had been, I was going to smash and grab every piece of paper and computer hard drive I could find. If there weren't, I would methodically go through all of the paperwork, computers, and maintenance records that were available. I sifted through everything. I got their manifests going back a month. I went into the garage and got their maintenance records for the last few weeks. A list of their available drivers, their trucks, and where they were located. The home addresses of Bob Schwern and the son of Matthew Gamble, who went by the nickname Trip Gamble, as he was the third of his name. I got solid photos of everything. I locked the door on the way out and got back up into my former position across the street. The building still had power, so I was able to keep my electronics charged while I worked. That was a long night. Trucking company paperwork is pretty dry as entertainment goes, and as I went through the manifests, I was trying to locate their routes on a map. I went through at least 2 cans of dip over the course of the next 8 hours. I was trying to stay awake. Crystal wasn't getting any closer. And these were the people who had moved her. The results were disturbing. The first thing that I found was a maintenance record from 4 weeks prior. The driver had stated he hit a large deer in Ashe County in North Carolina. It was bad enough to require a new headlight assembly and a bumper. It was dated the day after Doyle was found beside the road, run over as he changed a tire in the rain. The driver was never found. I read all of the articles. Doyle and Crystal lived in a town called Jefferson, which was the seat of Ashe County. When I started putting it together, that these people who were involved in human trafficking may have been involved in the actual death of one of my friends, I felt like something broke inside my head. I didn't let it get the best of me, though. Second finding was that the company had contracts to regularly move produce and car parts along a few different routes in the southeast, and regularly made runs that took the drivers as far north as New Jersey. One recorded trip had passed through Jefferson and noted that they dropped off an empty trailer and picked up one loaded with produce that had somehow exchanged hands through a private transaction that the company made. On paper, it looked like some owner-operator had a truck that broke down and needed the goods moved one way or the other. so for a fee, they took the trailer out. If I hadn't known for certain that they'd been paid to transport 5 human beings out of that town, I would have just kept looking. From there, I had a hard time figuring out exactly what I was looking for. I sorted the manifests and records to isolate the unscheduled pickups. Found a few. They hinted at a partnership with a carrier in Maryland that moved their unscheduled pickups farther north to an unrecorded destination. I needed more information. Going by the records that I'd found, the trucking company was possibly involved in a large-scale human trafficking operation. If even a quarter of the unscheduled pickups had human beings in them, just like the one that Crystal had undoubtedly been on, they were moving at least half a dozen people every few weeks. All to Maryland. All the trailers picked up by an anonymous carrier. The data I had stolen revealed to me that the next unscheduled pickup was coming from Jefferson again. Probably the 2 abductees that the shirtless one had mentioned regarding their quota. I could go down there all guns blazing and free them and feel like a big fucking hero, so long as I wasn't dead. But that wouldn't get me closer to Crystal or the location she was being taken to. I had to wait. I had to follow the trailer all the way in. The truck and driver that was on the books to get the trailer was leaving within the next 24 hours. I set my sights on them, ate some food, got some rest, prepared to follow them. I must have put more miles on my truck during the investigation than I had in the last 6 months during my trial. I followed the driver back down to North Carolina and picked a truck stop outside the town where I could wait for him. A couple hours later, he came back through fully loaded, and we made our trip up north. Traffic most of the way was heavy enough for me to avoid detection, but as it got dark, I had to follow him from farther and farther away, until sometimes I was barely sure I still had the right truck. It was really late, somewhere around 3 a.m. when he finally made a stop. We ended up in an abandoned shopping mall on the outskirts of town. It was desolate. The mall looked like it had been abandoned for years. The parking lots were huge and empty. I circled the mall on the main road as the driver backed his trailer up to a loading dock, got out of the vehicle, and went inside a service entrance. I parked out of sight and made my way on foot over to the mall. If they made the transfer in the lot, I would have just observed from a distance, right? But they were doing something in there, and I had to know what it was. I looked around for police, and there were none, so I worked my bunk keys until I could get the door open, went inside. It was dark in there, but I needed to know what was going on. No one was going to bait and switch me now. I wasn't going to get the wool pulled over my eyes when I was so close to finding out where this chain of custody terminated. I remember specifically how bad it smelled. The air felt thick, like I was actually breathing the dark. I walked down a hallway, found a door to my left to the actual dock. No one was in there, but I could hear voices. Voices and a faint hint of a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I followed the sound, down the hallway, to a door that led out to the actual mall itself. The men were walking and talking, but I couldn't understand them. It was so strange to me how easily they walked through the mall in the dark. I could see, but I had to watch my steps so I wouldn't trip over the random trash and debris on the ground in front of the empty chained-up storefronts. Eventually, they made their way to a large open atrium, and as I got closer, the whispering sounds increased in volume. It wasn't as loud as it had been before, but it was loud enough. I put my hand on my weapon instinctively. If Dolores or one of those things like it was close by, it would spot me easily. I'd be in the middle of a shitstorm like I'd been in the woods. The mystery driver walked the other man into the middle of the atrium and hit a switch on some construction lights that lit the whole room up in one direction. It was startling at first, but the way they were angled, I was actually behind them, which would make me way harder to see as I crouched behind the remains of an old planter. They started talking, and out of the shadows stepped black-clad figures that I could only guess were members of the Order, like the men in the woods. In the light, I could see that they were all lean and mostly tall. A couple of the smaller ones appeared to be females. The mystery driver stood in front of them, and it looked like he was being given orders, instructions. The whispers got louder in my ears, and a new figure approached them from behind. It looked like a man, except the legs that were of normal length terminated in a torso that was elongated, like it had been stretched. I guess the best way to describe him is that he looked like a toad walking on two legs. The outside of his body was human, but he moved and looked like something much larger had been stuffed inside of him, and the outside had just been stretched tight around it. His face bore no expression, and he never turned his head. He just shifted his whole body when he looked at them. In my mind, I had already decided that I was about to be found again. I braced for it, but it just didn't happen. He opened his mouth and spoke, and an unnaturally deep voice came out of him, speaking a language that sounded like some kind of fast, guttural gibberish. He motioned at the order and back to the drivers, and then walked up to the mystery driver and stared down at him with his enormous, dead, unmoving eyes. His mouth worked open and shut while he breathed heavily with his chest puffed out. The mystery driver took a step back and looked over at the driver I had been following. The toad man then got between them and stood extremely close to the Schwern and Gamble driver and stared down at him. He spoke again in that guttural gibberish, fast and deep, and gestured with his hands. All at once, 3 members of the order seized the driver and plunged a short, sharp object into the back of his head. He fell limp, and that toad thing seized him by the throat with one of his hands and turned back to the mystery driver, holding the limp ragdoll body of a grown man effortlessly in one meaty fist. The order walked back to their position on the other side of the atrium, and the toad man brought the dead driver's face to his mouth and sunk his teeth into the flesh of his cheek and tore off a hunk that he slurped down and swallowed without chewing. It issued a command to the mystery driver and the members of the order, who then all immediately retreated to a different door in the atrium and left. The toad thing stood in the lights and casually consumed pieces of the dead driver's flesh. He broke off the driver's fingers with his teeth and swallowed them whole, all while staring off into the dark. I had to get the fuck out of there. I found the door behind me and went back down the hall. I ducked low as I passed by the door to the loading docks and peeked outside through the service door. They'd already hooked the trailer up to the new truck, which was sitting idle at the loading dock. There was movement inside the trailer, but no one was outside. I sprinted back to my vehicle and made a split decision. I had a real-time GPS tracker that we had used in my security office for monitoring company vehicles when we took the executives out, or needed to know what an unscrupulous employee was doing with the company cars that came back with unreported mileage. It had been part of my normal kit, and I'd kept it with some of my other gear when I was fired on the spot for the shooting. It was just expensive enough to be worth selling and keeping, but just inexpensive enough not to be missed. I'd run the risk of my old employer suddenly seeing a missing tracker pop up out of nowhere, but at this point the risk was acceptable. I'd rifled through my surveillance equipment bags in the back and found it next to some spare camera batteries and the remnants of my shotgun mic. It was time for me to take control of the situation. There was some kind of hulking monster of a thing that had eaten a man inside that building, and the order served him. I was going back in, and I'd have to just catch back up with the truck on the interstate. Wherever that truck was going, I'd be following it blind, unless I got at least some information from them about what they were doing. I screwed a suppressor on the barrel of my rifle and threw it in a small carrying bag that wasn't easily recognizable from the road. There was still no movement at the service entrance, so I sprinted back across the parking lot where I couldn't be seen and warily approached the truck. I turned the tracker back on and secured it to the trailer inside a magnetic case it was stored in. From there, I ran around to a different entrance and broke in through another door, since I had no idea where they actually were in the loading dock, and the driver could walk out of the service entrance any second. Inside, I stripped the bag off the rifle and started working my way back to the atrium. I was hunting, this time. I was going to hit them quietly and let the truck leave undisturbed, then catch back up with it somewhere down the road. If it was cargo they cared about, they'd guard it until it left. In the back of my mind, I just had to ignore whatever horrors were taking place in that trailer while I was outside. In the atrium, the toad thing was working on the driver's torso now, and had taken off most of the flesh on his face. The bones were so white under the bright construction lights that it looked fake. The order was somewhere in the building, and when I found them, I'd have to take care of them too, if they saw me. I took the legs out from under him with the rifle. The rounds made hard snaps in the quiet of the atrium as he fell flat on his ass and started talking in that horrible voice again. And as I got closer, it started to make sense. It was as if the sounds he was making were probing me and adapting to something I could understand as a language. We were alone. I kneecapped him for good measure and kept my distance. "Shut the fuck up," I said over and over again. He didn't react to the pain. He just sat there looking up at me, pointing with his hands and jabbering on. I took a few steps closer and aimed at his forehead. If I couldn't make any sense of what this thing was saying, I couldn't leave it alive. I put my finger on the trigger and started to squeeze, and I will literally never forget what happened next. It was as if his words just came into focus. Suddenly they made sense, like some tumblers to a lock in my head had been set just right. He looked me in the eyes, and he said, "Stupid thing." I raised my eye from the sight and kept my finger on the trigger. "What do you do with the prisoners? You fucking tell me. What do you do with them?" I asked him. "Birth," it said. "With the farmers." The whispers started asking me questions again. The one-word answer didn't help at all, and I didn't like how calm this thing was being. "What the fuck are you? What's wrong with you?" "Stupid thing. Stupid. I eat." I looked him up and down. I was done. He wasn't being compliant, and I didn't want to be caught off guard by the order with this thing still alive in between us. It had the strength to hold a man's dead body in one hand effortlessly, and I had no idea what other kind of strengths it might have. It hadn't tried to attack me yet, so I preempted its next move by shooting it between the eyes. It collapsed on the ground, and something that looked like thin brown water leaked out of the back of its head. I had taken the chance to come back and try to interrogate this thing, and it had given me nothing. I stood over it, pulling security on it to make sure it wasn't getting back up when the members of the Order opened up the door they had exited through earlier and filed out into a cluster. They went for their weapons as soon as they saw me. I aimed at the right side of the group, and I walked my rifle across them, shooting in successive bursts as I went. I reloaded the rifle while I still had a round chambered, and then went left to right. A couple of them had managed to draw on fire, but they were too close together, and they were being shot at by a Marine. They fell in a pile, all tangled up. They were clawing at each other, firing both at me and wildly into the air. I felt a round whistle by my head and scrambled for cover. Bullets turned the ceramic tile of a planter I ducked behind into shrapnel and dust with a series of hard snaps. Unable and unwilling to stick my head out, I laid the rifle over top the cover and blindly sent rounds downrange. The shooting lulled for a moment, and I spilled out from behind the cover on my side, trying to engage them from the floor. The ones who were standing got cut down. I scrambled to my feet and rushed them so I could hit the shooters who were laying against the wall on the floor. I got them too, and discarded their weapons into a pile. One of them was still conscious, trying to go for a knife, but he was weak. I slung my rifle over my back and took it from him easily, and grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the mess. I remember the sound of the fabric tearing and squishing like a washcloth that was being wrung out. In the middle of the atrium, I leaned him against the planter that I had taken cover behind. I was about to start asking him some questions when all at once it sounded like someone had torn a strip of leather in half behind me. I turned around, drew my pistol, and witnessed horror. The Toad Man's side had burst open, and two dark, wet arms were coming out of it. A shape that looked as if it were made of mud that was slowly dissolving emerged. Two large black eyes, a wide, toothless mouth mounted on a flat, wide head, and a pair of short, fat arms on a shapeless brown torso. It smelled like it was made of shit and sulfur. I let out a long, wet groan as it sloshed and smacked its way across the tile floor, crawling towards the order member I was about to interrogate. I shot it, over and over again. I threw up. I pissed at my pants. I was done with it. It was a dissolving, flat version of itself laid out on the floor, like wet mud. The guy in black was dead. After that, I rifled through all of their pockets, collected the contents in a pile, and backed my truck up to the door so I could load it in my spare bag. I changed my pants and washed off with some water and baby wipes I kept for emergency hygiene. It's embarrassing, but that's how it works. 3 things happen when a combat stress reaction starts. Your heart rate redlines, your bladder lets go, your bowels let go. And apparently that goes double if you see some kind of toad made out of feces crawl out of the body of a dead man. Even if you didn't have to piss before, you'll do it then. I'm not gonna lie, it scared me to death. I was still confident, but it shook me up real bad. I got back with the program shortly. The firefight in the empty mall hadn't given me any information, but there were a few less bad guys walking around. It was almost a win, but I considered it a tie. I had the personal belongings of the men I'd killed in my truck. I checked the location of the trailer, which was now about an hour down the road, and then rummaged through the belongings of the men I'd killed. All of the firearms were of the same caliber, .40 Smith & Wesson. The serial numbers were missing from the weapons, and they were higher-end models. A couple of carbines and some pistols. They had silver and gold rings with quartz crystals of varying size, and some medallions engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. All of their phones were burners. Notebooks were the real finds. Inside they contained strange sentences and phrases, words repeated over and over, and sigils. Some contained names, places, and what appeared to be written coded logs of something arriving and leaving. One in particular had the words 4 foxes left, and noted the time, which was an hour ago. It was a shipment of humans. I backtracked through the book, and there were other foxes marked as arriving and leaving, various dens and yards. Their journeys all seemed to end at the farm, and they all seemed to have the same number of stops, save for the one trip that I had interrupted. The farm. The toad thing had mentioned farmers before. I had to get going, though. I made hasty notes about the findings for reference and left. On the road, I was assailed by thoughts of ambush and failure. If I was clandestinely delivering human cargo at a location, I'd know full and well if I was being followed. I'd set up countermeasures and scouts. Couldn't risk that. I didn't know where they were going. Something else had to happen. I had to take a risk. If all of the trips had the same number of stops, and they were so meticulous about tracking the cargo, it made sense that they wouldn't be throwing any surprise halts into their schedule out of nowhere. It was a risk to assume that they hadn't been spooked by my appearance in Jefferson. I'll admit that, but I couldn't find any other way to approach the problem. The abandoned mall was the second to last stop in all of their trips before the farm. I decided to let them go on and close in on them when they stopped. So I took one last long look at the GPS, which indicated that it had somewhere around 20 hours of life left, and slowed my truck down. I spent the next 12 hours driving casually. I ate, refueled, followed their general route. By daybreak, they were in New York State. I was exhausted from hours of driving. It was completely impossible to stay awake, so I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, locked the doors, and fell into a fitful sleep. I remember thinking, this is how I'll lose them. This is how I fuck up. But my body wouldn't let me stay awake for any longer. The adrenaline from the shootout had burned me out, and I was finally coming down from the rush. I woke up to the sound of an air brake. It was still daytime when I sat up. I checked my watch and I'd slept about 4 hours. Immediately, I checked the app for the GPS and saw that it was still sitting in upstate New York. I went in the truck stop and bought some food and water, assuming that I wouldn't be able to do so again for a long time, topped off my fuel, and left. There's not much to tell you about that drive up there. I could wax poetic about how beautiful the country really is once you get past the city and what the fall colors look like and all that, but I'm not going to. That's not what this is about. What this is really about is what I found up there, and what I saw and learned. That hidden America that I told you about before. That's where all of this takes place. That's what I've been trying to relate to you. I don't have a bunch of intriguing stories about weird characters I met on the road or interesting details. What I've got is what I remember, and what I remember is this. When I got up there, I found nothing but vast stretches of rural farmland. The few trucks I saw were mostly old, rusted-out things where I was. I found a little dirt road that extended beyond the highway and pulled off onto it. Down that road, I managed to get to a point that was somewhere around 4 or 5 miles away from where the truck was parked as the crow flies. I waited until nightfall on that road, going through spells where my heart would race at the thought of being so close, followed by intense dread at what I could find. I remember thinking about finding barns full of people, and maybe a compound like Auschwitz or Dachau, where people were being forced to work, or more sinister things, like that toad thing or Dolores keeping people in captivity so they could sell them. Or even more sinister things, like that thing that crawled out of that toad thing's side being cared for by the captives. Horrors were coming to me like I was near some kind of nightmare generator that was beaming thoughts into my head. I checked and rechecked my gear compulsively. I had close to the same loadout as before, except I ditched the surveillance gear. Back in the Corps, I would have called this a direct action mission. I was hunting. My investigation, or operation rather, had gone from one of reconnaissance intelligence gathering to a hasty night raid after I made the rash decision to take my rifle back into the mall. Part of me kicked myself for that fact. I went ahead and called the location into the regional FBI office like I'd done in Jefferson on one of the burner phones, and indicated that it was related to the incident in Jefferson, and dropped the name of the order just to be sure. The man on the other end of the phone was very professional and understanding. I topped off my water and tightened my straps, stepped off. It was dark, but there were no clouds. In the moonlight, I didn't come close to needing illumination at all. I made good time going in as the terrain was mostly pastures interspersed with patches of trees. I didn't see any livestock. When I reached the trailer, it was sitting abandoned, unhooked from the truck on another dirt road like the one I had parked on. There was a worn footpath that cut off beside the road into the woods, and I followed it. Under the trees, it was harder to see. Every few steps or so, I would halt so I could hear my surroundings better. But there was nothing, only silence. Farther down the path, in the crisscross of shadows under the moon, I heard the whispers start in on me again. Do you like the dark? Where's your family? Go away. That's how I knew that I was getting close. The trees thinned out again, and ahead there was a farmhouse. An enormous sun-bleached barn lay beyond it, next to a decaying grain silo. It was covered in vines. At the tree line, I took a knee and used the optic on my rifle to observe the area. The house would be a poor place to contain multiple prisoners, considering that the group I'd seen in Jefferson mentioned that they had ordered at least 7 specifically. Prisoners and captives need guards. Conventionally, they'd be posted in concealed positions and roving, but I saw none. The whispers kept at me with their questions, until they were pierced by someone screaming in my ears. Cunt, cunt, piece of shit, filth, mundane piece of shit, fuck. I started and reeled, swinging my rifle and guarding myself from a grab. The voice was flying around my head, screaming expletives, hovering in my face for a second before quickly darting from one place to another as it screamed. As it did, more joined in screaming in my ears from all angles. I had never experienced anything like that. A voice free of a source, flying all around me, invisible, varying in distance, piercing. It sounded like an old woman screaming for her life. The others moved away from me, and as they did, I could hear a long, unwavering whine, like an air raid siren, that petered off in tremolo above me. Things were climbing down from the trees a few meters away. I couldn't see well around me, so I moved toward the house. The voice was screaming in my ears, screaming its curses with an unbearable volume. In the yard around the house, I could see the vegetation breaking and moving near the tree line, and that's where I saw the first one. I sprinted around the house, scanning my periphery as I went, and ran toward the farmhouse. Being made releases you from silence. You no longer have to conceal yourself. You no longer have to step carefully. A fever descends on you when you allow yourself to embrace it. You are not just free to seize your objective and go loud, you are obligated to. They came out of the woods on all fours. Inky black bodies, shaped like men and women, with limbs that terminated in hands. They had hairless canine heads on their bodies affixed with permanent drooling snarls. Each was followed by a voice, and as it moved, they followed, like it was part of them, dictating where they went. They behaved like dogs, following those screaming voices, running at me in straight lines. I cut them down as they came. My suppressed rifle thumped quietly as the bullets popped and smacked their flesh. There were 4 of them scattered in the yard. As each fell, the screaming stopped. I dragged their surprisingly light bodies 2 at a time into the tree line as it tapered in close to the barn. My rational mind expected more, but nothing came. I kept moving fast anyway. My priority was the barn, then the house, then the silos. The barn had 2 large main doors on either side, and then a smaller one. I picked the lock and went inside. The whispers stopped completely. The interior was lit by what looked to be oil lamps placed throughout the structure. On both sides, the walls were lined with crude board cells. They were full of people that moved around as I entered. It smelled like rotten meat and sewage. I gagged as what could have been as many as 100 curious eyes looked on. I cannot possibly describe the place to the level of detail required to do it justice. There were sigils and symbols carved into every surface. The floor was caked with a slick brown mud. The deep shadows of the room concealed the faces of the people in the cages. There was sobbing and the sounds of babies and small children crying. I would have searched for Crystal immediately. But that place, the horror of it struck me with awe. Down the middle, on the other side of the barn, where normally tractors would have been parked, was what looked like a spider the size of a crowd of people. It looked like it was all legs. It was thrusting hard against the floor. And with each thrust, I heard the ragged, gasping cries of pain. Behind it was a glass tank full of thick red liquid, flanked by smoking braziers. Around it stood what must have been 10 members of the order, and at their feet were the limp, naked bodies of a small boy and a young girl. Streams of thick, clotted blood had collected in pools around their groins and backsides. Kept thrusting. My God, that noise, that wet thumping sound compounded with the dry bristles of its legs rubbing against one another, the creaking of its legs, those pathetic hoarse sobs with each thrust. I raised my rifle. I didn't know where to aim because literally all I could see were legs. My heart felt like it was going to explode. As I put the pad of my finger on the trigger, the legs extended and walked toward me, each one thumping against the wet ground. It sounded like horses' hooves. I just started shooting. But as I did, it raised up and inverted itself on its legs and revealed an underside that I can only say looked like labia. They peeled back. As they unfurled, the torso of a skinless, emaciated man emerged. Where his pelvis would be, there was a massive, pointed, insectile phallus with tiny tongues that licked out at the air. I was so horrified that I stopped shooting only long enough to center my sight on his head. Behind him, I could see the order standing over a woman who was hemorrhaging from her vagina and going into convulsions. That thing had raped her to death, and the others too. As I went to pull the trigger again, its commanding voice spoke inside my head. Wait, it thundered. I hesitated. Stranger, you have found us, killed us. The voice was so loud I knew in my mind that it had to die, but I felt some resistance in my head as I went to pull the trigger while it was speaking. We let you in here, funneled you here, to me. It was only a matter of time. Do you think we would just let you come into our woods, walk onto our farm, so you could try to kill me? Do you think you can stop this? I had to find Crystal. She had to be in the barn. I rested my finger on the trigger and made up my mind that I would try to get my answers from this thing one time before I killed it, and then killed the others, and then manually search the property for her. Infiltrate, attack, exploit, exfiltrate. The raid made whole. Where is Crystal Kent? What did you do with her? It laughed, mocking me. They don't have names. None of you have names. None of you have anything except your purpose. It went on, seeming to know that I physically couldn't shoot it or even move when it was talking to me. You think you're the first person to try to stop us, the first man with a gun to come for us. I funneled you in here. I brought you to me the way I brought them. You have only your purpose, you simple, mundane, powerless waste. It pointed to the red tank, in front of which the Order were now chanting as they threw the bodies of the dead woman, girl, and child in. The bodies began to dissolve and disappear as they floated. You, mankind. You are to us as the fertilized egg is to the unborn human soul. You are us, in that you are made perfect to contain us as we are born into this world. The bony, skinless humanoid arm pointed toward the glass tank. You are our ancient race. You are our currency and our pleasure. It drew the last word out, obviously trying to keep me paralyzed for as long as it could. Now, wait, it said. Its voice hushed. Wait. The Order came closer and surrounded me. Disrobe him. I will have him too. The second his voice ceased, I was free to move. I pulled the trigger. The round hit him somewhere in the humanoid anatomy of his body, and as he tried to speak, it sounded like his voice was cutting in and out, like someone rapidly twisting the volume knob on a stereo. They were all on top of me. It was a blur as I fought with them over my rifle. I was being kicked and punched, and they were tearing at my clothes and my hair. When my hand made its way back to the grip, I pulled the trigger as many times as I could, as fast as I could. Men were screaming and writhing around on the ground. One struck me in the head with an object so hard that I saw stars. As I fell to the ground, I realized I was out of ammunition, but didn't have time to reload my rifle. I transitioned to my pistol, and as I did, one of them shot me in the chest with what looked like a revolver. It felt like I had been hit with a sledgehammer. More were on top of me, but as they grabbed me, the giant spider thing crashed into them. It had regained its composure and was thrashing through the barn, crashing into the cages and knocking them open, killing its own servants as they tried to do its bidding. The human torso had retreated back into the body. I kept shooting into the legs, sometimes amputating them, but there were countless, and it didn't even seem to slow it down. In its blind rage, it grabbed a member of the order and carried him over to the tank. It threw him inside, and then climbed in as well, submerging itself in the liquid. The one with the revolver got to his feet. I shot him in the pelvis, and as he buckled and fell to the ground screaming in pain, I stood up. I shot the wounded and saw the slide on the pistol cocked back. The magazine was empty. I reloaded it and holstered it. I took one of their knives and stabbed him in the neck to save ammunition. My search through the cages were frantic. There were so many. I went by each one and shined a light in at their dirty faces. They pleaded to me for help. It talks to us at night. God, it talks to us and we can't make it stop. It tells us horrible things, one woman said as I passed by her. Please help me. I kept going. If this was where they kept them, this is where Crystal would be. The red liquid was bubbling over to thick froth at this point. I hoisted myself up and climbed to the second level, peering into each tiny, crude cage. I passed by a few before I heard, Hank, come back. Hank. A woman's voice called me Hank. The only human being I'd ever allowed to call me Hank was Doyle. I ran back to the cages I'd already checked and found her. She was filthy and naked. I told her it was going to be okay and used a large fixed-bladed knife I'd kept with me since I was in the service to pry the boards off. I took her out and helped her down. The spider thing was still in the tank, so I left it there. I crashed through the door to the outside and reloaded my rifle. In the dark, I could see a pair of bright, yellow eyes on a huge dark body lumbering toward us from the house. Keep running, I told her. Don't stop, no matter what. I went ahead and turned on the light on my rifle so we could see. The thing was a giant, burly creature that walked upright like a man, made of what looked like wet mud. It opened its mouth and let out this horrible, wet, croaking roar. And as it did, more yellow light glowed from its mouth. We narrowly avoided it. I shot at its legs to try to keep it from following us, but it just stood there. And as I did, I saw a figure run out of the barn that was now behind us on the far side of the mud thing. A naked figure with a bloated neck and stomach. It looked like the male version of Dolores. Holy shit, Crystal, keep running, go, I yelled at her. The ground was hurting her feet, and she was walking in tiny, painful steps and wheezing as she tried to keep up with me. Who knows how long it had been since she'd eaten and I found her as well. I kept leading her through the woods, almost having to drag her at times. The black dog people with their screaming, disembodied voices were in the woods with us too, chasing around our heads as they gave chase through the underbrush. I shot at them sporadically and reloaded when I could get Crystal to run beside me. Finally, the girl collapsed. In the moment, I couldn't tell if she was exhausted or dead or what, so I said fuck it and put her over my shoulder in a fireman's carry. I ran as far as I possibly could with her, and I got farther than I thought I would. She'd obviously been starved. She had a small figure, but honestly, it felt like I'd carried packs that were heavier. We broke out of the woods, passed by the trailer, and I didn't put her down until we had to hop our first fence. She came to her senses a little and weakly climbed over with me. I put her back on my shoulders and ran with her again, without looking back. As we gained ground toward the truck, I slowed down to a walk and hiked her out of there like a field pack. We made it to the truck, but I still wanted to get the fuck out of there. I gave her food, water, and clothes, and called the FBI number again. I couldn't understand why I hadn't had any response whatsoever. It had been hours. If it was a bomb threat, they would have had an armed team there so fast that they would have showed up before I even called. I thought that surely they would be willing to bite on a missing persons tip that had been called in. The field office wasn't even that far away. The man from before answered. I asked him when the agents were going to show up at the farm, when rescue was going to arrive for the people on the tip I just called in. Sir, I don't understand, he said. I don't see any recorded calls from this number. What did you say the missing person's name was? I took the battery out of the phone and threw it out the window. The FBI weren't coming. They were never coming. They never did. To them, it was like this never happened. I remember sitting there, all beaten up and fucked up in the seat of my truck, with my dead best friend's widow sitting next to me. She wouldn't let go of my arm. It wasn't like romantic or anything, but she held on to me. As long as I was around her, she held on to my arm on the way home. She ate and drank, but didn't sleep. And she never said a word to me again. After another day of driving, I got her back to Junior Barnes' house just outside of Jefferson. They cried when they saw each other. He took us inside and looked me up and down. God bless you, son. God bless you. You done good, but I ain't gonna ask you how you did it. Not at all. He gestured, and I sat down at his kitchen table with him. Crystal walked into the bathroom off the hall that I could see down from the kitchen and started to shower. Junior, you can't stay here. You need to take that money, get in your big rig, and get the hell out of Jefferson forever, I said flatly. You and your boys, if you want to keep them, you have to leave. What do you mean? He asked me. He sat down in the chair across from me and laid his old cap on the table. The people that took her were here in this town. They took more women, too. I didn't tell him about the farm or the demonic beings I'd encountered, but I did tell him about the men in the woods, and that Crystal had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. I told him that the FBI was never going to help us, and that the Jefferson Sheriff's Department was complicit in her abduction. He thought about it for a long time and put a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek. Eventually he looked up at me as if he was asking if there was more. I nodded and packed a can of dip. I put it in my lip and told him the final piece of information he needed to know. There was a trucking company. They led me right to them. They moved the girls from a pickup point somewhere here in town until they made their way to the farm. One of them reported that they hit a large deer here in town to their maintenance shop the day after Doyle was hit beside the road. They killed him. And even if I told him, he cut me off. Even if they did, he trailed off. I was in the Army in the early 70s, he told me. I had a friend. His name was Jim Stedman. We'd been next to each other since the plane we took over there. One day we were patrolling, doing security near a village, while our platoon sergeant was looking through the hutches for VC. Out of nowhere, a bullet comes through the trees and it pops him in the back of the head. We opened fire. They pushed out while we tried to help him. There's blood coming out of his head all over the place. It was all over me, even though I was trying to hold on to his head. By the time our medic got over, he was ghost white, and I was covered. My clothes were soaked through. It was even in my boots. We never found the man who shot him. Hell, we never even came close. Me and the medic threw him on a litter and they carried him back to the village to go back to Sergeant Kowalski. I told him, I said, Sergeant, there's gooks out there in the woods. They shot Stedman in the head, and he just looked at him. We looked him up and down. And he told me that they couldn't find hide nor hair of any VC in the village. He ordered us to pack up. And I was crying, stumbling through the woods with Jim's blood all over me, squashing out of my boots while I walked, carrying his pack and tripping over roots when we walked through the jungle. My squad struck camp that night. Our squad leader, Sergeant Brown, let us make a fire. I was sitting there, still crying, still next to Jim when the boys from my fire team came up to me and they told me they were going back to the village to look for that gook that shot my buddy. They wanted to know if I was going too. I did. I went out there, but we wasn't looking for some slow hiding in the woods with a rifle. He spit a black rope of tobacco juice into a red solo cup that was in front of him. We burned that old goddamn village down, son. I locked eyes with him for a moment. He looked away. And that hard look left his face when he started wiping his eyes. I understood. There's war in you, he told me. Before I left, he promised that he'd protect Crystal with his life, and that they'd leave town as soon as they could. He thanked me again and gave me a parting gift. Doyle's first rank insignia from his time in the Navy, the very first bars that would pin to his collar. I left. There was war in me. No matter how much beer I drank, or how well I starched my suit, or how heavy my bench press got, that war was still there. There was a reason why Doyle and I had gotten along so well. It was in him too. It was why we made those long drives to go wild on the town and let it out. The war was like a rhythm, like a heartbeat, waiting for a reason. Waiting for an enemy so that I could visit it upon him. I went back to Georgia and found my storage unit the same as it had been when I left. I slept in there for hours and hours on a sleeping bag on the floor. I traded out my broken gear and deposited the evidence that I wouldn't need for a while. Fresh sappy plates, magazines, ammunition, fresh clothes, underwear. I went out the next day and took a shower at the gym without even trying to pretend I was there to lift weights. I cleaned my rifle for the first time in what seemed like an eternity by my standards. I set up a packing list and repacked all my gear into my truck. I had extras with me this time. Less surveillance equipment, less evidence collection. I wasn't going to need it this time around. This time I brought things like night vision equipment and infrared designators for my rifle. The drive took a few hours, but I was so ready for what happened next, and in my heart, I didn't even care. When I reached Neon, I put my gear on inside my truck and went straight to Bob Schfern's house. His house was out by itself on a hill away from town. Good for me. Bad for him. I parked a half-mile down the road near an old, closed general store and climbed the hill, then walked it around until I came down the backside of his property, behind his house. I shot his transformer out with my rifle, still using the suppressor, and after the sparks died down, I turned my night vision monocle on and switched to my infrared laser. I invaded his house. I picked the lock on the back door and cleared it room to room until I found him looking for his house phone in his dark kitchen and charged him. "Bob Schfern," I bellowed. "Put your hands behind your head and get down on the ground." He lost his shit and knocked over the drying dishes on his counter. I put the laser right on his forehead as he complied and slammed him to the ground, where I zip-tied his hands behind his back. He kept asking if I was under arrest. I didn't answer him. I drug him into his living room, sat him up in a chair. I shined the light from my rifle in his face. "Tell me everything you know about the Order. Now." I had been asking questions about people and things for a long time, without getting any real answers from these types. I was going to be goddamned if I didn't get any now. He asked me what I was talking about, so I slung my rifle over my back and hit him in the stomach as hard as I could. He groaned and fell over on the couch, so I sat him up and backhanded him. "You're gonna fucking tell me," I said. I struck him again. "Oh, you're gonna fucking tell me." "They just give me money," he said. "Bullshit." I zip-tied his feet together, took my fixed-blade knife out, cut his pajama pants from the knee to his ankles. "I'm gonna run this blade down your fucking shins until you tell me." "They just give us our marching orders and pay us. I don't know what to tell you." I pressed the knife into his flesh and pushed the blade down a couple of inches, and he gave in. Fuck, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. "I'm not the fucking cops. Give me the information. Okay. He told me that the order had been paying them in cash to pick up and transport adolescents and adult females for transport to Maryland. He told me that they got their instructions from creatures from another world, and that Trip Gamble had been buddying up with them a lot lately. He said that Trip came over for dinner a couple months ago, talking about an event he went to with the order, that he'd promised them to keep secrets, but he couldn't hold it in. Bob told me that Trip had actually seen it as a business meeting because they had offered him the opportunity to handle their routes. Bob asked him what the other routes were, and Trip said they had other operations like the one in the southeast, all over the country. He said that the order had millions of dollars that they were willing to spend on transporting the people that were abducted. He said that Trip mentioned that the order actually worships humanity, so Trip didn't think they were bad, and kept mentioning mankind as some kind of sacred beast. All over the country, I asked him. As in, they have multiple operations like the one you help them with right now. Yeah, they do, Bob said. Bob swore to me that he'd keep his mouth shut so long as I could promise him protection, that he'd even be a witness in court. I've got all the information you need to bring him down. I laughed a little. You think I'm a cop? I asked him. His eyes got wide. I tried to coerce him into giving me the names of the other locations they were taking people to, but he didn't seem to know much about it. He did, however, know the Trip was in a little bar in town. Now, Bob Schvern was a criminal making profit in a continuing criminal enterprise that dealt in trafficking human beings, and he knew perfectly well what he was doing. I was burning hutches, the same way Junior Barnes did. As I drove away from his house, I could see the light from the fire over the hill. I went to Tripp's home address. He wasn't there. I stashed my truck again and made my way inside and took no special care while rifling through his belongings. In his home office, he had an old Schvern and Gamble trucking sign hanging over his desk. I broke into his file cabinet next to the desk, and inside, among various other financial documents, I found a folder marked Order. He had a map of various states with curious symbols drawn on each of them, 3 5-pointed stars. Nothing else was written. I rolled the map up and kept it. Further search revealed that the bottom drawer of the cabinet was still full of cash. I emptied out a gym bag and started filling it up. As I was doing this, I heard a vehicle pull up, and someone stumbled inside. I finished up with the bag and carried it out to the living room. Trip spilled through the door into the room and saw me immediately. "Who the fuck are you? Get the fuck out of my house," he yelled and pulled a pistol on me. I was fine with that. I shot him, threw cooking oil all over the kitchen and the electric stove, and turned it on. As the eyes heated up and the oil started to catch, I leaned over. "Your people killed Doyle Kent and abducted his wife," I told him. "You can fucking burn." He gasped some words at me that I couldn't understand, and I left with the money. On my way out of town, I started a diesel fire at their company building. I didn't wait around to see what happened. The next day, I was back at home. The police never came for me. They didn't come when I was getting released from my apartment. They didn't come when I corroded the firearms I'd used away into nothing. The police didn't come when I was wide awake late at night with the TV on, with that horrible thumping noise stuck in my head, lifting weights in the dark, concentrating on anything but that with the glow of the TV in front of me, hearing that same noise as I lifted the iron up and sat it back down. Thump. Thump. That poor woman. Thump. I was going to find her.